Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. This week we're shifting our attention from Mesopotamia to look at what might have been the dominant civilization of the Levant in the 24th century BCE, the Empire of Ebla. Specifically, we're looking at its conflict with the city of Mari sometime around 2300 BCE. Now, you may remember that we mentioned Mari last week as a city Sargon the Great destroyed as part of his conquest of what was probably the world's first empire. But we didn't talk about Mari or its place in what we now call the Middle East or any of the other states of the Bronze Age Levant. So this week, that's where our focus is. Eventually, we're going to get to the Battle of Terqa in about 2300 BCE. Though just like so many of the other battles from this era, we don't know much more than it happened. But first, Ebla and Mari. In our history classes, we usually talk about Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt as if they were the only games in town in the Bronze Age. That approach makes a little bit of sense within the constraints of a world history or Western Civ class. After all, you need to get through the old stuff quickly so you can get to Greece and Rome, which are generally more relevant to the development of what we call the Western world. So all you really need to know to pass the test is the bare bones of bronze to iron to steel, Sumer to Akkad to Assyria to Babylon to Persia to ancient Greece. Ancient Egypt is usually mentioned in parallel mostly because it's interesting and without much of a hint as to how the societies might have interacted. In pretty much every world history class I ever took, those stories took about 2 lessons. Maybe preceded by day 1 where we talked about the Stone Age in broad strokes. Because not only are these states from a long time ago, but we don't know much about them. And the faster your teacher can get you through them, the fewer questions he has to answer. But as we've already established, I hope, these parts of the world encompass their own thriving states, fully as busy and vibrant as today's large towns and small cities. While their cultures might have been hard for us to understand, their lives wouldn't have been that much different from ours. They lived closer to the land, with a greater proportion of them engaged in the day-to-day production of food than in a modern society. And they had no social media or cars or air conditioning, but they got up in the morning and they went to work, they paid rent, they worried about their kids, they complained about other people's kids, they drank with their friends, they complained about the new government policies, and they spoke longingly of the good old days, and they looked forward to a day when they could hand the work over to the next generation and relax a little while. In short, they were people, a lot like you and me. And they weren't just living in Mesopotamia and Egypt. By the 2300s BCE, people were everywhere. So let's do a quick geography lesson. We tend to think of the Middle East as a vast desert, or at least that's how I thought of it before I studied a little more about the region. Yes, it tends to be hot and dry all the way across the region, especially in the summertime, but most of it is not desert. We're going to go from west to east, looking at the areas most of us in the West think of as part of the Middle East, or at least similar in culture and climate. First, we'll look at North Africa. This area is largely Mediterranean in climate, although it's hotter than the coast of Europe to the north. The wind blows north to south off the Mediterranean, bringing water and making the coastal areas of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia fertile and easily habitable. As you go south, away from the sea, the coastal region gives way abruptly to the Sahara Desert, which is a lot less habitable. Libya and Egypt are more or less the same as the rest of North Africa, except the desert comes much closer to the coast than it does to the west. And Egypt has something no other country has: the Nile. The longest river in the world, it provides fresh water to a long, narrow stretch that would otherwise be desert. And every year it dumps thousands of tons of fertile soil across its floodplain. It's this flood cycle that keeps the desert from claiming the Nile Valley and allows people to grow food there. That's why the famous civilization of ancient Egypt developed in the Nile Valley. Moving north and east across the Sinai, we come to the region known as the Levant. Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, enjoy a Mediterranean climate that becomes drier as you move east away from the sea. Most of the dry desert parts of this region are in southern and western Syria and Jordan. As you move north and east, you run into the mountains that form Turkey's southern boundary. As you get up into the mountains, you get more rain and milder temperatures, which allow forests to grow. North of the Levant is Turkey, the region the Greeks called Asia Minor. Surrounded by the Mediterranean to the south and west and the Black Sea to the north, with its interior pretty much surrounded by mountains, it enjoys a climate very similar to Greece and the Balkans. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers run out of Turkey's southern mountains. These rivers are pretty much what made Mesopotamia the cradle of civilization. So following the rivers south and east, we come to Mesopotamia, where most of our battles have been so far. Most of this region lies within what we now call Syria and Iraq, extending east into Iran. This region is hot and dry, with some rain in the winter and spring, but the rivers provide enough fresh water to allow agriculture to develop. Their flood cycle made the soil in their combined floodplains the most fertile in Southwest Asia. Pretty much all the city-states we've talked about so far have been near one or the other of these rivers. Going south from Iraq, we see what Mesopotamia might have looked like without the rivers. The Arabian Peninsula is the desert we think of when we think of the Middle East. Strips of fertile land near the coasts, hot and dry in the interior. Yes, people live there, but it's not the kind of land that supports a thriving civilization. Even the famous cities of Mecca and Medina are on the western side of the peninsula, where they get some of the moisture blowing off the Red Sea. Heading east from Iraq, we start heading up. From the western border of Iran all the way to Pakistan, we'll be in the mountains. Temperatures trend lower than Iraq, but the mountains make travel more difficult. The area around Tehran is flatter than the rest of Iran, but surrounded by mountains on all sides. And eastern Afghanistan and northern Pakistan are in the foothills of the Himalayas. Go north from Iran and Afghanistan and you get into the region of Central Asia called the Steppe, a grassy area similar to the American Great Plains, but at higher latitude. This region will become important to us later because it's probably where people first domesticated horses, but right now it's outside our scope. So yes, there's a lot of desert in and around the ancient Near East, but the area we're looking at is far from inhospitable. That's a pretty long way to go to explain that there's a lot of space for people to live outside Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley. The area we're looking at today is more or less between them if you think in terms of how people traveled in the days before air travel and paved roads. Traveling by land, you would need to stick to areas where you could find fresh water and food, which means traveling through the Levant and following the river valleys. By sea, you could take a shortcut across the Med from Egypt to Lebanon or Syria, or across the Red Sea to the Arabian coast. But once you get off your boat, you still have to travel up the coast. And sea travel would have been much more challenging than it is today. Even a voyage down the Red Sea and around the peninsula up to Iraq from the south would have been dangerous. Except for the Polynesians and possibly the Sea Peoples, who we'll talk about in 1,000 years or so, just about every ocean-going culture we know of would have been hugging the coast during this period, rarely allowing themselves to pass out of sight of land. So a land route between Mesopotamia and Egypt would have followed the rivers and the Mediterranean coast. A land route from Europe would have crossed the mountains of Turkey and then followed the rivers. A land route from Afghanistan or Iran would have wound through the mountains until it found the Tigris Valley and then followed the river. I haven't been able to figure out the route the tin would have taken from Afghanistan to Mesopotamia. A sea route from Europe would have landed in the Levant and then followed the rivers. So, in the 24th century BCE, we would expect to find cities on the Levantine coast and along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And spoiler alert, that's exactly where we find them. Which brings us to the peoples involved in this week's battle. The two main combatants are the cities of Ebla, about 60 miles inland from the Syrian coast, and Mari in the Euphrates Valley, about halfway between Aleppo and Babylon. These cities are outside the area of the Fertile Crescent we call Mesopotamia, and they were part of a culture that grew up outside Sumer. They were Semitic, from the culture that ultimately grew into the cultures of the Middle East today. Now, it's not clear that there was any ethnic difference between the Sumerians and the Semites. The difference would have been cultural and linguistic. We don't know where the Sumerian language came from, and it died with them except for their writings. But the languages spoken by the Semites in this period would have been the language of the Akkadians, and later the Assyrians and Babylonians, and would evolve into modern Hebrew and Arabic. The Sumerian culture seems to have been based mostly on farming, while the Semitic cultures seem to have been based largely in trade. If you've been paying attention to the geography, you'll see immediately that Ebla is ideally suited for trade goods coming to and from the Mediterranean coast, and Mari is ideally situated for trade goods coming up and down the Euphrates. If trade is happening between Egypt or Europe and Sumer, or between Central Asia and Egypt or Europe, it's probably passing through these two cities. And the evidence seems to show that trade was going in both directions, which means these two cities, even though they're about 300 miles apart, are in the perfect position to become powerful and rivals. Why rivals? It's pretty simple. As far apart as these cities were, there wouldn't have been a lot of need for regular contact between them. So any diplomatic messages or news of the world would have either traveled with the caravans or simply been trusted to them. And if trade coming from the south has to come through Mari, and trade coming from the west has to come through Ebla, and news travels with the trade caravans, it's easy to blame any perceived shortage in quality or quantity on the other city. Especially since you don't want to blame the traveling merchants. You want them to come back, after all. Traveling merchants would have picked up on this dynamic in about 5 minutes, and the savvy ones and the less ethical ones would have found profit in playing the cities off of each other. So you get a vicious cycle where the natural suspicion between two groups of people quickly spirals into rivalry, then outright hatred, and finally open war. Well, open war erupted between Ebla and Mari sometime in the 25th century BCE, so they'd been at war for generations by the time we get to this week's battle. The first record we have of this war is a letter from Mari that names King Ansud and says he attacked Ebla, conquering many of its cities. Both Ebla and Mari would have had several satellite cities, either governed directly by them, under partial control, or allied with them. The letter mentions a back-and-forth pattern where Eblite kings pay tribute to Mari, then one manages to defeat Mari and suspend the tribute for a while. Then the tribute starts back up again, presumably in the aftermath of a victory by Mari. The letter comes from Mari, so it doesn't mention any tribute paid by Mari to Ebla in the periods when Ebla was on top, but we can imagine it went both ways. But why would a self-respecting state pay tribute to its rival? This is a question that's going to come up again and again, so we should probably look at it now. There are generally two reasons: survival and pragmatism. In the first case, there's really no choice. An enemy has sacked your city or destroyed your ability to fight him, or both, and the only thing standing between your people's lives and his swords is whatever you can offer him to convince him to go away. This is the kind of tribute you see when a conquering army sacks a city. The second case is really a math problem. War is expensive. When we talk about a state spending blood and treasure to defend itself or attack its neighbors, we mean that literally. When a homeowner spends $1 to feed his family or decorate his home, that dollar stays in the community, allowing the merchant to grow his business and helping the homeowner improve his living situation. Both parties are better off, and the economy grows. But $1 spent on keeping a soldier in the field, feeding him and arming him and keeping him healthy, doesn't grow the economy as directly. Each soldier in the field is a healthy young man near the peak of his physical ability who isn't growing food or making something or transporting something that'll make his community better. And if he dies, his potential economic contribution to the state will never be realized. So by sending him to war, the state risks significant long-term loss over and above what it has to spend to send him there. So sometimes it just makes more sense for even a strong state to pay an adversary for the privilege of not being attacked. If a state can pay less to make an enemy go away than it would otherwise spend to force him out, it sometimes makes sense to just fork over the cash. Of course, this often leads to another problem. If you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want a glass of milk. If you show your adversary that you're willing to pay him to go away, he's probably going to show up next year or the year after, demanding more money. And eventually, the demands become great enough that it makes sense to try to kick his ass out of your home. That's how the cycle usually works, and that's how it probably went down between Ebla and Mari. So the fight went back and forth for decades between these two rival cities, with Ebla on top for a while, then Mari, then back. Just like with all these ancient wars, we can be pretty confident there were battles we don't have any record of before the one we're talking about today. So what makes this one different? Why would the scribes and kings of Ebla go to the trouble to record this fight but not the earlier ones? Well, it's important to remember that they probably did record the others. If we had access to everything the Near Eastern societies saw fit to write down, we'd probably have a very good record of who fought whom and where and when. Even if Ebla only recorded their own victories and Mari only recorded theirs. Remember that the kings of this period were really only interested in recording the things that made them look good, so we would have to combine the records to get a complete picture. But after 4,300 years, the records just aren't there anymore. Clay tablets are durable if they're left undisturbed, but every time you move them, you risk breaking them. And that's assuming every civilization that moved through that area is just as cautious about not damaging artifacts as we would be, which we know they weren't. Conquering armies aren't usually keen on protecting the historical treasures of the conquered unless they can be convinced the treasures are part of their own heritage, and not always then. If you've ever watched a group of teenage boys try to break something just to see if they can, well, the phenomenon is a little like that. And in a few minutes, we'll see that the kingdom of Ebla was not long for this world, even in the wake of what looks like it was probably a major victory. And that's just the people who might care enough to break the stuff. Bear in mind that most of the people who came into contact with this stuff just wouldn't have had any idea what it was, and probably wouldn't have been able to read it even if they knew what it was. If they picked it up, it might be with the vague idea that it was old and possibly valuable, or old and cool, or old with the right shape and size to have some pragmatic function. It's possible that somewhere in Baghdad or Damascus, there's a record of a critical event that's holding down a stack of paper, or propping up a table with a broken leg, or holding a door open. So the records we have are what we have, at least until something turns up that helps us fill in the gaps. So the Battle of Terqa is one of the records we have. What does it tell us? Not much, unfortunately. It looks like the vizier of the king of Ebla, a man named Ebla, got tired of Mari's shit and decided to deal with the situation once and for all. So he made alliances with the cities of Nagar and Kish and marched against Mari. A vizier, by the way, is something more than the senior advisor to a king, a title that would remain popular in the Middle East at least until the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, Ebla met the army of Mari near Terqa, near the modern-day city of Tel Ashara in eastern Syria, and kicked its ass. No idea how thoroughly he kicked its ass, but it turned out the answer to that question would be irrelevant within a generation, because a guy named Sargon was in the process of conquering Mesopotamia and would soon be turning his attention upriver. Now, just that little nibble raises all kinds of questions that I haven't been able to find answers for. Nagar was a smaller kingdom that lay between Ebla and Mari, and it clearly made the calculation that if it had to pick one side or the other, it was more likely to find success with Ebla than Mari. So far, so good. But what about Kish? Are we talking about the sometimes dominant city in Sumer, as far downstream of Mari as Ebla was upstream? If so, how did Ebla coordinate with them to keep Mari from concentrating its forces against them one at a time? and what part did they play in the battle? If not, well, we know where Ebla and Nagar and Mari were. Where was the other Kish? And let's not lose sight of the fact that this seems to be the first evidence we have of an international coalition coming together to smack down a troublesome adversary. Even if all the members of the coalition came from the same general area, this is a pretty big deal. We've seen plenty of examples of conquerors combining the armies of several vassal states into their own army. But this is the first we've seen of nations coming together voluntarily. It's a testimony to what a pain in the ass Mari was, or how powerful Ebla was, or how impressive Ibbi was as a general or a diplomat, or some combination of these factors. But we shouldn't ignore it, even though we really don't know a damn thing about it other than it happened. And of course, there's the elephant in the room. Why are we talking about Ibbi the vizier and not about the king he worked for? Hell, you could write a novel about this story if you didn't mind making some logical guesses as to what the world of the ancient Semites looked like. That's probably the closest we can get to visualizing how these events might really have gone down. I, for one, don't have time to write a novel about this campaign, but I'll put together a quick dramatization. Remember that this is a semi-educated guess intended to fill in the holes in the records we have. It's not based on solid historical evidence. I'm pulling it out of my ass based on what we've already discussed about Bronze Age warfare. I'm setting the battle in the city because that makes more sense to me tactically, but it may be more likely that the two armies met on the plain outside the city. We really have no way of knowing, so bear in mind this is my story of how the fight might have gone down. No shit, there they were. So Ibbi has had enough of Mari's shit, and he gets his king's permission to go put him in their place. Or maybe the king is the one who's had enough. Or maybe Ibbi convinced his king that the king had had enough. But he knows he has a better chance of winning with allies on his side, so he starts sending out runners with messages. He probably contacts Kish first, along with several other of the Sumerian city-states, just to see who might be interested. This would have been a tricky business because whatever messages he sent would have had to go along one of four routes. The first route, down the coast to the Red Sea, then around the Arabian Peninsula into Mesopotamia. If Mari had effectively closed the Euphrates, this seems like the most likely route over which trade could have continued. Second route, north into the Armenian highlands, then east to the Tigris and down into Mesopotamia that way. This route might have followed whatever trade routes brought tin from Afghanistan. Route 3, across the Syrian desert. There are people who make their living or even their way of life crossing deserts, but it's almost never the optimal route. Or Route 4, down the Euphrates. This route would have passed through Mari itself, so the messenger would have had to run his boats past the city at night, or cut cross-country around the city, or schmooze his way through Mari's defenses. If you wanted to write this novel and include a hero or supporting character with zero self-doubt who could talk a bear out of its skin, this is the route to pick. Make damn sure Ibbi can trust him. Any of these routes would have been dangerous and would have passed through plenty of territory Ebla didn't control. Ibbi probably would have started these messages a year or more before putting his own troops into motion. The messengers would have been merchants, or would at least have traveled with merchants familiar with the route they were following. They probably would have memorized the message rather than carrying written tablets. A tablet can be dropped or captured, and nobody else can intercept a memorized message unless the messenger chooses to share it with them. The message probably wouldn't have asked Kish to join Ebla's attack directly, since that would have required troops to cross whatever difficult route the messenger had to traverse. Instead, it would have appealed to their mutual interests, suggesting everything would be better if they could restore trade and offering favorable terms to whatever cities wanted to help. It might have asked them to keep Mari busy and looking south, make belligerent moves, or march against Mari's downstream side, or detain traders coming from Mari, or even stop sending food to the city. It might have provided a very general timeline for Ebla's move, But when it takes weeks or months to move between cities, close coordination just isn't possible. If both cities were making an effort from opposite directions at roughly the same time, it would have to be enough. The next set of messages would have gone to Nagar, a small kingdom sandwiched between Ebla and Mari, and in danger of being crushed like a bug in their on-again, off-again wars. These messages probably would have said something like, "The end game is coming. Wouldn't you rather be on the winning side?" Ibbi probably would have offered a carrot and a stick. "You help, and we'll be best friends forever. We'll respect your autonomy and come to your aid if Mari ever comes after you again. You don't help, well, you know the kind of damage an army can do just marching through, and we don't like your chances if Mari decides to retaliate." And then finally, he sends letters to the cities within the kingdom of Ebla itself. These would have been easy. Your king commands you to send so many troops to this location. Have them there by such and such date with at least this many war wagons and this many infantry equipped with axes and spears and helmets. The rest would have been what would come to be called levies in later centuries. Draftees commanded to show up with whatever weapons they had, most likely clubs or hunting spears or hunting bows or slings. Doesn't look like there was a lot of difference between peasants and slaves in the ancient Near East. So these guys would have just been poor bastards called up from their farms to go kill somebody for their king, or get killed, but the recruiters probably didn't talk too much about that part. So the local kings or governors or satraps or whatever they were called had their marching orders, probably to assemble somewhere on the Euphrates, well inside territory Ebla controlled. For the sake of having an easy landmark, we'll set their assembly point at the south end of what's now called Lake Assad. The lake wouldn't have been there, of course, as the Tabqa Dam wasn't finished until 1974, but it's not a bad place for an army to assemble. If you can find a convenient bend in the river, you only have to protect one side of your camp from attack, and you have an easy site to load and offload supplies. From the dam site, about half the march to Terqa is through friendly territory, which makes it less likely that your enemy can ambush your army on the march before you've had a chance to work out some of the kinks inherent in a big group that's not used to working together. And you can pick up more forces along the way as latecomers find you on your route. They probably would have assembled in the fall. The thing about raising an army in a pre-industrial society is that most of your soldiers have to be engaged in food production when they're not soldiering. That means you can't have them until the hard work of the planting season is done, and you have to bring them home before the hard work of the harvesting season starts. The weeding and watering in between can be done by the women and those who are too young or too old to go to war. In the Middle East, most crops grow from late summer to early spring because summer is too hot and dry for cereals like barley and wheat. That means you can only fight between about October and March, what we call the campaign season. I mean, you could theoretically fight between harvest and planting, May to August, but when temperatures get up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to lose as many men to the heat as you will to the enemy. Winters in the Middle East tend to be pretty mild. The temperature rarely drops below the 40s, and you get a little bit of rain in many areas. And here's an interesting tidbit. When I was in Kuwait waiting to go into Iraq, the desert would get 5 o'clock shadow when it rained. Grass would peek up right out of the sand where you would swear nothing could grow. It turns out it's true what Ian Malcolm said. Life finds a way. Ibbi troops start arriving in mid to late October then, and by mid-November they're ready to march. Once again, we have no idea how many men we're talking about, but if Ebla itself is a city of 40,000, and it can draw levies from many smaller cities within its empire, then around 10,000 is not an unreasonable number. That's about the capacity of a good-sized high school football stadium, so not a huge crowd by our standards. But put all those people together, then move them all together, considering every one of them has to eat and drink water and sleep and shit and do everything humans have to do, you start to realize what a massive undertaking this would have been with Bronze Age technology. It's about 130 miles from Lake Assad to Terqa, so all these people are going to be together for a while. The easiest and fastest way to move them would be to put them in boats and sail them down the river, but that's probably a non-starter. Even if you can find boats that are big enough to carry 50 people plus their crews, you need 200 of them just to move your army, not including your war wagons or the supplies you're going to need to feed so many men. And the boats available to Ibbi-Sipish would probably have been big enough to carry 10 or 20 guys at most. So it's much more likely you'd put your supplies in the boats and let the guys walk. That limits your pace to 10 to 15 miles a day, 20 if you push hard. Much faster than that, and it gets a lot harder to keep your formations organized as guys start falling out from exhaustion, which leaves you vulnerable to attack. Not to mention you can't move that fast and have your troops at their best when you get to the battlefield. Now, I'm not saying you can't walk 20 miles in a day. My personal record is 32 miles in about 20 hours, and I'm no physical stud. But I was in no condition to fight a battle at the end of it. And moving 10,000 guys 20 miles is a whole different animal than walking 20 miles yourself. So the army walks along the Euphrates as their supplies and probably most of their commanders ride in the boats. At 15 miles a day, they would reach Nagar in about a week, at which point they'd probably have picked up 2,000 or 3,000 more troops, as well as guides who could lead them through friendly territory. 2 or 3 days in Nagar, and they would have passed into Mari-controlled territory. Did they know they were marching on Terqa? Maybe. The city was 30 or 40 miles upstream from Mari as the crow flies, and the two powers had fought over it many times throughout the war. It looks like it was a major city in its own right, with its own defensive wall, as you would expect from a city that's been repeatedly assaulted over a century or two. Ibbi-Sipish may have been planning to capture Terqa to extend his own territory nearer to Mari itself, either to extend his control over the river trade or to give himself a base of operations where he could attack Mari directly in the next year's campaign season. Or maybe he was planning to march past Terqa, maybe giving the city fathers a chance to join him in his march on Mari itself. Whatever he had in mind, he would have wanted to at least make sure whatever troops were in Terqa couldn't attack him from the rear after he passed them by. Maybe he meant to leave the troops from Nagar there to block any attempt to sortie out and hit him from behind. At any rate, he couldn't ignore Terqa, and Mari didn't want him to. The Mariot king would have known Ibbi-Sipish was moving against him probably pretty soon after he started his march, unless Ebla had better control over traffic on the river than I think it did. A huge army marching downriver from Ebla with an armada of boats shadowing it on the river would have been hard to hide. Certainly the king would have known by the time the Eblites passed his border. He would have wanted to meet him as far forward of his own city as he could. A walled city just inside his territory would have been the logical place to defend from. So what did he have to defend with? Again, we have to guess. Mari was probably about the same size as Ebla, so around 40,000 people in the city. If Terqa was half that size, then the two towns together can mobilize about 6,000 men. Add another 2,000 from the rest of Mari's kingdom, which was probably smaller than Ebla. So we're looking at about 8,000 men, of which 800 were trained infantry and charioteers. But he can't send all 8,000 upstream to Terqa, because remember, Kish is threatening him from the south. So he has to keep enough troops in Mari to repel an attack from downstream. That leaves him maybe 5,000 or 6,000 to face the 12,000 coming down from Ebla and Nagar. Not ideal, but far from hopeless if he can get them into Terqa and fortify the city before Ibbi-Sipish can get his troops there. By the time Ibbi-Sipish gets to Terqa with his army then, the city's locked up tight with 6,000 guys inside, plus whatever local troops were already there to garrison the town. And now he has a problem, because he doesn't have enough men to assault the city. If you're ever in a position to attack a prepared defensive position like a walled city, remember this general rule of thumb. The attackers need to outnumber the defenders by at least 3 to 1. That's the kind of advantage things like fortifications, prepared fighting positions, and what we call interior lines, which is the ability to move troops a shorter distance than your enemy to reinforce your lines, confer. Unless he's moved a lot faster than I think he has and reached the city before Mari can, he only has about a 2-to-1 advantage. Which means all the Marites have to do is stay where they are until March or April, when Ibbi-Sipish will have to march his guys home so they can harvest their crops. If he doesn't, the people of Ebla will start starving a couple of months later. And a vizier isn't a king. No matter how clever he is, he doesn't get to claim to be chosen by the gods to be where he is. If the people are starving and somebody's head needs to roll, let's just say it won't be the king's. And Terqa will be a hard city to besiege at any rate. Laying siege to a city is a pain in the ass under the best of circumstances. And a city that sits on the main trade route for the entire region is even more so. Because what you want to do when you lay siege is cut your target off from resupply so they'll run out of food and give up before you have to go home. If the target's landlocked, you can surround it. When its major supply route is a huge river, that's a whole nother level of difficulty. But the river also gives Ibbi-Sipish an opportunity. See, a gate is a weak point in a wall. Doors are thinner than stone walls, and they're designed to open. You can attack the planks of the door, or the latch if it's accessible, or the hinges if they're exposed. A door doesn't have a foundation, so you might be able to dig under it if you can distract the defenders long enough. Or you can bash it in with a ram if you know how to build one that's big enough. Or you can set the damn thing on fire and get through it that way. If you've ever seen the elaborate gate systems on some medieval castles, often a double outer gate defended by towers that allow defenders to shoot at anybody who gets close, then a narrow stone passage where the ceiling and walls are perforated with aptly named murder holes, then another gate to hold the attackers in the passage while the defenders do their work through the murder holes, you have some idea just how hard it is to properly fortify a gate. The point is, gates can't be ignored. They have to be guarded, and the more gates a city has, the more potential entry points it has to guard. And gates on the river are probably less fortified than those on the land side because it's much harder to mass troops against them. So, that's probably where Ibbi-Sipish went. Of course, there were forms to be observed first. He would have approached the main gate or sent somebody with a message, something like, "Hey, we'll let you go if you open the gates and let us have the city," or maybe you could send out your best champion to decide the issue in single combat against our best champion. In response to these offers, the garrison, most of whom would have been able to count, would have farted in his general direction. Oh well, on to plan B, which was really plan A, because Ibbi-Sipish knew only a great fool would have accepted his offer, and his adversary was clearly not a great fool. He pulls his emissary back, and he attacks the walls. Maybe he waits until dark. Maybe he even waits a few days or weeks, trying to lull his enemy into complacency, thinking maybe he's just going to try to starve him out. Good luck with that. Maybe he makes a big show of constructing siege ladders and rams where the defenders can see him, so they can see an attack is coming and guess where it might come and reinforce the low points in the wall. Maybe he attacks several nights in a row, never assaulting the same points twice. Or maybe he does attack the same points repeatedly, trying to establish a pattern and let his enemy think he knows where the next attack is coming. These attacks would have to be small, because he doesn't want to waste too many men before he launches his main attack, but big enough that the enemy doesn't start wondering why he isn't attacking with his full strength. Depending on the terms of their alliance and the warmth of their relationship, he might assign the troops from Nagar the honor of assaulting the walls. But he can't do it too many times because eventually his allies are going to start wondering why they're being thrown against the walls in stupid-ass attacks every night with no hope of success. And then they'll start leaving. Allies or not, slaves or not. So he repeats this tactic enough times to make it clear what his pattern is. Then he launches his main attack. Another assault on the walls, this one more intense than any that came before, and it includes his own Eblite troops. But he also sends a small force, maybe with the help of local merchants who will be recognized as friendly, down the river to the Watergate. The local merchants, who maybe haven't been local that long, managed to talk the guards into opening up, because the regular guards have been called to reinforce the defense against what looks like a serious attack, and the poor dumbass kids on the Watergate have no idea they're the only thing standing between their city and a world of shit. And now the gate's open, and 20 guys leap out of the boats and rush in before the poor bastards know what's going on. Knives and clubs and sickle swords make quick work of them. Maybe they're all down, but more likely one or two get away. They're going to run like hell. If the attackers are lucky, they'll run home where they feel safe before they think to run to warn the other guards. But that kind of luck isn't something you plan for in this kind of operation. Which means now it's a foot race. The attacking force has to get to the main gate, get it open, and hold it that way long enough for Ebla's forces to start pouring into the city. And they have to do it before the defenders figure out what's going on and pull enough guys off the walls to stop them. Balls of solid bronze on the motherfuckers pulling this off. See, 20 guys won't last long once the defenders get wise to what they're up to. If they're caught in the open, it's game over. Their most decisive weapon is surprise, and that means they have to move faster than rumors can spread in a city under siege. Maybe they split up and head for different objectives to confuse things. Maybe a couple of two-man teams split off to light fires or make noise. Maybe they brought horns or drums or rattles or whistles or some other noisemakers to sow chaos and keep things fuzzy for the defenders. A few thousand years later, they would have brought explosives to damage or destroy some important but non-critical target. But not in 2300 BCE. So by the time they get to the gate, the guards are alert and wondering what the fuck is going on, but maybe not expecting the shitstorm that's about to roll over them. When they see armed men running toward them, their first thought might even be relief that there's somebody here to tell them what's happening and what to expect. Because when we're tired and confused and scared and expecting the attack to come from out there, we're always more likely to believe what we want to believe rather than the ugly truth that's about to kick us in the ass. Hell, if they're really ballsy and there's only a couple of guys on the gate, the attackers might act like they're supposed to be there and ask why the hell the gate isn't open yet. But because there's going to be a counterattack and they're there to lead it, why the hell do you think they're asking? One way or another, the attackers get the gate open. Now they have to signal the waiting troops that it's open, because the friendlies might not be waiting right outside the gate. That would give away the game. More likely, they're far enough out that the guards on the walls can't see them in the dark. If there's a big enough hill or low area, or maybe a field with crops standing in it, they're probably concealed behind it. They can send a runner, slow but maybe more secure and more certain, or they can signal from the gate with a torch or lantern or horn. Faster, but it might be harder to confirm your friendlies got the message. And now the bad guys definitely know something's up. Which brings us to our second foot race. The forces waiting in reserve outside the gate have to get to the gate and get at least some of their guys through the gate faster than the forces inside Terqa can block it. This operation is more complicated than it seems. Ebla has enough troops in the field that Ibbi might have kept a third of his troops, or even half, in reserve, waiting for this gate to open. If you've ever been part of a crowd that's trying to get through a door, you know it's not a simple thing. In this case, the gate is much wider than your average 3-foot door, but you're moving 4,000 or 5,000 people armed with sharp things through it. This is going to take a while. Again, surprise is critical. If the commander of the reserves has kept his guys waiting and ready, instead of letting them sit around shooting the shit with their gear off, he can have them up and moving pretty much immediately. If not, well, similar attacks have failed because the guy in command at the critical point didn't move fast enough. Maybe he wasn't paying attention, or maybe he was too conscious of how exhausted his guys were, or maybe he was butthurt that he didn't get a better gig in the battle. Or maybe he didn't understand the plan. Or maybe he didn't agree with the plan. Or maybe he was just afraid. If you stick with me long enough, we'll see all these and more. But this guy knows what he's doing. He's not going to let the whole campaign go to shit just because he couldn't get his guys through the gate. In fact, if Ibbi is the pro I think he might have been, he's the guy in command of this attack. Or else, he's handpicked a crusty old veteran commander to put in charge of the whole show. That's how critical this part of the attack is. So they get through the gate and start pouring into the city. And for the inhabitants of Terqa, the ordeal just got a lot worse. Disciplined troops are going to start hunting the enemy, looking to press their advantage and keep the Mariots off balance. Because if they can organize a defense, this is still far from a sure thing for Ebla. Urban warfare is a nightmare today, and it would have been a nightmare 4 millennia ago. First, narrow streets keep you from forming up and maneuvering the way you want to, as well as stopping you from bringing overwhelming numbers to bear. Second, buildings give the defenders plenty of places to hide. And finally, by defenders, we're now talking about not just the armed soldiers, but pretty much everybody who lives in this town. Because now they're not defending a city. They're defending their homes and families. Old men and kids who would just be in the way on the walls can pick up kitchen knives and table legs to keep a few bloodthirsty sons of bitches away from their wives and daughters and mothers. And those wives and daughters and mothers are perfectly capable of doing the same in a pinch. Thank you very much. Which brings us to what undisciplined troops do once they're inside the city. See, these guys have been away from their homes for a month or two, sleeping rough, eating lousy food, surrounded by thousands of other guys in the same condition. They've spent the last month or two talking about how many enemies they'll kill, and the last several nights watching and maybe engaging as one fruitless assault after another batters itself against the walls. Whatever they told themselves about how wicked their enemies are, they've seen plenty of evidence to support it the last several nights. They're tired, they're scared, they're a long way from home, and on top of all that, this just might be the only chance they'll ever have to enrich themselves. So they're going to start helping themselves to anything that's not fastened down. That includes any woman or girl that crosses their path. Now, I don't know anything about the rules of war in the ancient Near East. By our rules today, the whole concept of sacking a city is out the window. Soldiers today aren't supposed to engage in looting or rape or wanton destruction. But comparing our behavior today to the arc of history shows us just how unusual that is. Because even into the 18th century CE, sacking a city was not just an unavoidable aspect of war. If the city chose to resist instead of surrender, it was expected. And after that, it wasn't exactly unheard of. So just in terms of what was probably normal in the wars of the Syrian Bronze Age, yeah, the folks at Terqa were in for a rough few days. And just in case I didn't make it clear a minute ago, it's not that the disciplined troops wouldn't sack the city. They'd just make sure the enemy couldn't mount an organized defense against them first. And at some point when their commanders said stop, they would stop. And that's about all we're going to say about what happens in a sack. If you want detailed descriptions of that, check out Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. His series on the Mongols, Wrath of the Khans, has some particularly graphic accounts. Although given how endemic war seems to have been in the ancient Near East, I imagine the Eblites treated Terqa almost gently compared to how the Mongols treated Baghdad 3,000 years later. So what did the Battle of Terqa accomplish? It's tempting to imagine that this was the battle that ended the war between Ebla and Mari once and for all. But reading between the lines, it looks like it didn't really accomplish much, except for changing the lives of several thousand poor souls whose only crime was to live in a contested city. Ibbi doesn't seem to have marched on Mari as we might have expected somebody like Ian Adam to have done. Which means whatever he was angling for, he probably got it, whether it was tribute from Mari or reopening trade on the Euphrates or whatever. But just a few years later, Ebla was destroyed during the reign of Ahidar of Mari, And maybe 10 years after that, Sargon of Akkad destroyed Mari. Hell, as fuzzy as the timeline is, it's entirely possible that it was Sargon who destroyed both cities. Some of the evidence seems to indicate that the Akkadians made it all the way to the Mediterranean coast. Both cities struggled back. People don't just desert favorable sites unless they have to, but whatever they were fighting over for more than a century was thoroughly irrelevant after Sargon started building his empire. And after him, the Assyrians would come through with their own empire, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Macedonians, then the Romans. You get the picture, I think. Ebla got what he wanted, probably enough to keep himself in his king's good graces, but nothing that changed the long-term picture, except that he gets to be remembered as the organizer of the world's first international military coalition. All right, so once again, we don't have enough information to analyze this battle by the principles. I'm going to do a quickie analysis based on the scenario I just shared with you, but it's no better, historically speaking, than my made-up story of the battle. So, reminder, each principle is graded on a score of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. I'll add a brief explanation for each grade. So mass is your capacity to bring overwhelming force to bear at the critical point on the battlefields. Both sides did pretty well here. Ebla managed to bring 2 nations worth of troops to the field and convinced a third to participate indirectly, so he gets extra kudos. But the Mariot commander did a pretty good job with what he had, especially considering he had to keep half his forces in Mari to defend against an expected attack from Kish. So Ebla gets a 5 here, and Mari gets a 4. Offensive, the degree to which you make things happen on the battlefield, rather than waiting for your enemy to take action. Outnumbered 2 to 1 on flat ground is not a great position to be in, so the Mariot commander probably didn't have many options for offense. We'll look at some commanders who could have pulled it off, but most of us would have just chosen to hole up inside Terqa in his shoes. Ebla did a good job keeping the pressure up. So Ebla gets a 4 here. Mari gets a 3. Surprise! Doing what your adversary doesn't expect. Ebla definitely gets the edge here, both in terms of taking the fight to Mari in its own territory and for the infiltration that got the gates open. Mari pretty much did what was expected the whole time. So here Ebla gets a 5. And Mari gets a 1. Security. Keeping your forces from being surprised and retaining flexibility to respond to what your enemy does. Mari did the right thing occupying the city and waiting for Ebla to attack, but they should have secured the river gate better. Ebla wasn't terribly concerned with security except for employing locals to guide them and keeping the reserves hidden from the city walls. So both of them here get a 3. Maneuver is next. This is your capacity to maximize terrain advantages and attack your enemy where he's weakest. It's hard for the defender to stand out here in a city under siege. Ebla gets points for deceptive attacks and for their final infiltration. So Ebla gets a 4. And Mari gets a 2. Objective. This is understanding what you're there to do and making sure your people understand it as well. Both objectives were clear. Ebla wanted to take the city and destroy Mari's army, and Mari wanted to hold the city until the Eblites had to leave in March. So both get a 3. Unity of command. Every soldier on the battlefield should be taking their orders from a single person, represented by a clearly defined chain of command. With no information except one name, I feel like I have to assume both sides were competent here. Ibisipish gets an extra point for bringing Nagar in. So Ebla gets a 4. And Mari gets a 3. Simplicity. The less your troops have to think about what to do next, the more likely they are to successfully work as a team. Night attacks, deceptive attacks, and infiltrations are all pretty complex. Mari gets the edge here. So Ebla gets a 2. Mari gets a 4. And finally, economy of force. Your ability to protect your own forces as you act against the enemy. Mari did a lousy job here, pulling some of their gate guards to help repel the attacks against the walls. Ebla, on the other hand, was able to attack in small enough numbers not to hurt their chances in the final assault, and they still managed to hold at least a third of their force in reserve for the decisive attack. So Ebla gets a 4. Mari gets 2. Total scores, Ebla's a pretty clear winner here. So you got 34 on the Ebla side and 25 on the Mari side. So that's the Battle of Terqa. If you enjoyed this little war story, don't forget to give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to tell your friends about us. Next time, we're going to jump forward another 300 years to the sack of Ur in 2004 BCE, the battle that seems to have put an end to whatever imperial ambitions the later lords of Sumer might have had. I hope we'll see you then. Till then, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.